Welcome to the RBC Sunday School Rewind. This is our Rehoboth Baptist Church Sunday School recap where we review the Sunday School lesson for the week. Please be sure to like us on Facebook and subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you like what you hear today, hit the thumbs up and share this message with someone else. And don't forget, let us know how we're doing by leaving a comment in the chat. I'll be sharing the recap for February the 20th, 2022, titled Enduring False Charges. Our lesson for this week is coming from the 8th chapter of Job. Our key verse is Job's first chapter, 1 through 2. Then Bildad the Shuhite replied, "How long will you say such things? Your words are a blustering wind." Today's lesson helps us to understand by looking at the life of Job that sometimes bad things happen to good people. With this lesson, we will see how Job remained faithful to God even while his friends questioned God's justice and Job's innocence. The story of Job gives us a prescription to follow when we personally experience or come in contact with someone else who is suffering. So we began our lesson today by asking the question, have you ever been falsely accused? Whether that false accusation was as an adult and it landed you in serious trouble, or if it was as a child where you got in trouble with your parents, I'm sure we all have probably been falsely accused of something we did not do. That is the position that Job finds himself in our lesson on today. So our lesson today comes from the poetic book of Job, which is a section of the Bible known as the writings. The theme of the book is the eternal problem of unmerited suffering. It is named after Job, who's a wealthy man living in the land of Uz with his large family and extensive flocks. God himself referred to Job as blameless and upright and someone who was always careful to avoid doing evil. We watched a video from the Bible Project that we'll include in the description below, and that gave the background for the entire book of Job. In the first chapter of Job, God granted Satan, the accuser, permission to test Job's devotion to God by taking away Job's children and his possessions, and even granted him permission to afflict Job with disease. Satan thought Job only served God because God had blessed him. Have you ever heard it said, "God, if you only bless me, I'll serve you the rest of my days"? However, in the midst of his suffering, Job continued to trust in and worship God and did not sin by blaming God for what he was going through. In chapter 2, we're introduced to Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, who are, after hearing of his tragedy, they got together and traveled from their homes to comfort and console him. They sat silently with him for 7 days, for they saw his suffering was too great for words. This is a great example for us when encountering someone who is in the midst of their suffering, and we go and see about them. The greatest ministry we can provide is the ministry of being present. The majority of the rest of the book of Job, up through chapter 27, contains the conversations between Job and his friends. When Job spoke first with his wife and then with his friends, starting with Eliphaz, he still refused to curse God. Now, although it hadn't been written yet, Job had the attitude brought to mind by James in the first chapter, verses 2 through 4, about faith and endurance. Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. For you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow, for when your endurance is fully developed, you will be perfect and complete, needing nothing. We can empathize with Job for questioning just how God could have taken away all of those blessings. God's justice is difficult to see or comprehend when we feel that we have been wronged and when we suffer loss. Job turned to his friends at this difficult time. So I have Sister Cabrina here with us, and I'm going to be asking her some questions throughout the recap today. So, Sister Cabrina, thinking back on our conversation during our lesson this morning, what were some of the things that we talked about as far as where we turn when things go wrong?
Thank you, Sister Karen. I enjoyed today's lesson. I want to tell you what a phenomenal job you did in facilitating the dialogue and how active our Sunday school class was this morning. But I think where do we turn when things go wrong? We talked about the ministry of presence. The ministry of presence is not to give advice. Is not to tell people or ask and question them like an interrogation. Or, well, what exactly did you do? You did something. That's not what it is. And we talked a lot about praying for folks. And so those things of being there in prayer and also being present, just meeting the need, being that ear. If they have something that they want to say, just be present with them to hear and to listen. And try your best not to give advice because they didn't ask for your advice. They're not looking for your advice. They're in the midst of a crisis. And what they need to know is that they have some people that they can depend on.
Yes, absolutely. It was a great discussion this morning.
It really was.
So everyone grab your Bibles, and we're going to start our lesson for today by looking at the 8th chapter of Job, verses 1 through 10 and verses 22 through 24. So our lesson began today when Job's second friend, Bildad, responded to Job's expression of grief in the previous 2 chapters. And as the young people might say, Bildad came in hot. He came in calling Job a windbag and asking him how long he was going to go on like this, talking about how unjust his suffering is. You see, Bildad believed that if you did what was right and were righteous, then God would bless you. And if you did wrong, God will punish you. In other words, God is a just God and he's going to do the right thing. And nobody gets off the hook. He basically was saying that Job must have deserved what he got because God is not unjust. And he always judges rightly. He even went as far as to say out loud that Job's children must have been guilty of some great sin or wickedness because the wages of sin is death and Job's children are dead. Whew. Sister Cabrina, we had a great discussion in the chat today about theodicy and retributive justice. I'll get it right.
You got it right.
Those terms a bit and tell us how they relate to today's lesson.
Yes, thank you so much. So theodicy is this, some people say it's justifying that God is still good. And but the question of theodicy asks is, how does a good God allow bad things to happen? And a lot of us really are challenged by this because we said God wouldn't let that happen. But here we have the story of Job and God let it happen. God gave permission. And so when we think about the bad things that happen with our weather, bad things that happen in our family, accidents that occur and people's lives are taken, how does this good and loving God allow those things to happen? And then we have to back up and think about God gave us free will. As human beings, we have free will. We make choices. And if we track all of the bad things back, pretty much we're going to find a bad choice somewhere down the line. Somebody made a bad decision, a bad choice. Even with the weather, we talk about climate change and stuff like that and the impacts of the things that we choose to do that have impact on our weather. The whole carbon footprint and all those things, recycling that we don't do diligently. And all the scientists have told us what the backlash of those things are, and we still do those things. The Odyssey. God allows it. But when you talk about Job is not, don't fit into that category. He's unique because Job is the one that the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? And so the Lord grants permission, and we see God giving permission to Satan to do whatever he would, as long as he did not take his soul, not take his life. And so God literally allows Satan to have access to Job because Job is righteous. Job did nothing wrong. He had done nothing wrong. Retributive justice. There are several types of justice that we talk about, retributive as well as restorative. Retributive justice says, if you do me wrong, I do you wrong. And a lot of people see God as a retributive God. If I go against God and I'm disobedient, then God's going to punish me for my disobedience. And that's not really how God operates. God is not that type of God because of his grace. Unearned and unmerited grace we get from God. And so even when we do wrong, God still loves us and forgives us as long as we have a repentant heart. So I think retributive is you get back what you give. Some of us would call it karma. And theodicy is that a good God does allow bad things to happen.
All right. Thank you, Sister Cabrina, for breaking those terms down for us. So in our last set of scriptures that we come upon for today, we see that it's evident, and some of the people in the class mentioned this, that Bildad knew of God, but he did not know God, and he didn't have a personal relationship with him. Bildad was sharing with Job what he had been taught, and that was that any suffering, just like Sister Gabrina kind of talked about, from God is a punishment for personal sin and or the sin of our parents. Bildad was encouraging Job to diligently pray to God for forgiveness before it was too late and beg the Almighty for his compassion and his favor. But Bildad should have known his friend, but he falsely assumed it was Job's own unrighteousness and sin that had caused these things to happen. In that respect, Bildad's words didn't seem to be very sympathetic or comforting. He meant well. And even though what he said was accurate about God, and Bildad had those great intentions, he made the mistake of jumping to conclusions about Job and assuming that he had sinned, and also in believing that the traditions of the ancestors had guided the situations of the day. So we had a vigorous conversation in our class today regarding the traditions of the ancestors. Sister Cabrina, can you elaborate a bit on that conversation?
Yeah, I'm going to pause with the curiosity that we enter into this text. Bildad, right? He was one of Job's friends, so he consider the council of the elders, the people that's in the community that we know we can trust. Bildad would have been among those council of the elders, and him, Job, and the other friends, they literally were the one people sought out for advice and guidance. So Bildad had a relationship with God, but in their relationship with God, they knew the God of what we would call the Hebrew text. Mm-hmm. They knew the God of Genesis, because Job takes place during the same time as Genesis unfold. In fact, Job probably falls within, before you get to chapter 12, before you get to an Abraham. So God is constantly trying to build this relationship with humankind, and humankind continues to be disobedient. And how God responds to their disobedience is with punishment. Yes, let's think about it. At Cain and Abel, God kicked Cain out, right? And so he had to work by his proud and had a mark on his head, right? And then Noah, disobedient, God wiped out the whole nation. Right. Then the Tower of Babel, blah, 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 blah. He scrambled their language. There were consequences for the bad choices. And so from their perspective, you do something bad, God punishes. That's what God does, because that's what they have been told from the ancestors. They have been taught that way, that you are to be obedient to the commands of God, what God had done for them and all those types of things. So this is before we even get to Abraham. This is before we even get to a Moses and a Red Sea experience. This is before all of that has occurred. Job is doing that time frame where it's just God trying his best to have a relationship with his creation.
Amen. Thank you. It just kind of helps us to kind of understand where this particular lesson is set in the scheme of the whole Bible story. So thank you for kind of putting a highlight on that for us. So as we look at our final scriptures in our lesson, it concluded with Bildad again. And what he was again doing is just assuming, based on what he knew, that God's actions concerning Job were in line with his justice, making that distinction between the righteous and the unrighteous. So in other words, he was saying, if God will not reject the blameless man, nor will he take the hand of evildoers, guess what, Job? You must not be blameless. You must be an evildoer. So even though he was right in what he said, his assumption about Job and his suffering was where he made his error. So what did we learn from this lesson regarding providing comfort to someone facing difficulty? You know, we learned that when we're trying to comfort someone who's suffering or experiencing loss, that we need to be careful when we're bringing up our past experiences and how we may have handled them. We need to remember that we're all different, and that what may bring comfort to one person may not bring comfort to someone else. And if we're not sure what to say or do, we need to be like Bildad and his other friends, Eliphaz and Zophar, and just sit quietly with them, and give them that comfort, that presence, being there in their presence, just being there with your friends. So Sister Cabrina, this kind of brings in you mentioned it a little bit before about grace, but do you want to tell us a little bit more about what we talked about today regarding God's grace?
Yeah, I want to talk about God's will. A lot of us inside of the conversation today talked about God's will being done. And so if we can acknowledge God's will being done, and that may not be the right words of comfort for somebody that just experienced a loss. So right. let's really consider those words. But if we ourselves personally, when we think about the things in these difficult times that we experience, we as believers know to celebrate that God's will be done, right? And we accept the will of God. And we know that we can't identify the will of God being good or bad because we don't know. We trust God. We trust God wholeheartedly. And so Pastor used a great term today. I texted to several friends. It was the backside of grace. And he gave a story of a young lady whose child was being bullied by a kid at school. And she was just outraged and sharing with others, like, what do I do? And she'd been to the school and everybody keeps making excuses for the child, because the child is exercising some bad choices. And so recommendation was maybe invite the child to your house and demonstrate to them what love looks like in a household. That's the backside of grace. Yes. And so when you think about it, Joe's friends that see him suffering, instead of trying to figure out what he had done wrong, maybe celebrating the things that he had done right, and maybe acknowledging that even in the midst of what you're going through right now, God still has full control, and we can see, and because we know you, that you are still in the hand of God. And so sometimes it's hard for us to see that because we are like the ancestors. No, something going wrong for you. You did something to somebody that caused that. And it may not necessarily be true. So the backside of grace, just think about the backside of grace, is that in the midst of all this stuff, sometimes it's just good for us to step up and be present with people, even when we don't understand, even when we don't agree.
Yes.
To be there with them. Just imagine. It was another question of if they're right or wrong. Yeah, even if you feel they're wrong.
That's right.
You know them, be present. Be present. Be present. Be present. And be curious. Be curious, because you really don't know what God is doing. So let God's will be done.